Today on Mondays with Mo, we're hanging out with an old friend, none other than The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. Releasing back in 2006 on the PC and the Xbox 360, and eventually the year after on the PlayStation 3, Oblivion was Bethesda taking their very successful open-world Western RPG on the console with Morrowind and bringing it to the next level. And Oblivion was very much that. It opened up its open world in a whole new way, got rid of the fog, showed an actual draw distance for the player, and really demonstrated what it was like to be in an open world where you could actually see the open world itself. Todd Howard even said in Danny O'Dwyer's recent No-Clip documentary that Oblivion is very much the game that gave birth to that saying of, you see that mountain over there, you can go visit it. And that's a part of what made Oblivion, I think, a lot more special for many of us than Morrowind was. Some people might say Morrowind was the better RPG, but it never really gave us that sense of immersion, that sense of atmosphere, that sense of being in a world that Oblivion was able to give us for the very first time. Walking out of that sewer for the very first time and just looking out onto that open world and really thinking to yourself, I can go anywhere. Like, where do I go? I remember being, like, unbelievably overwhelmed by the prospect of just the game not really 100% telling me where to go, and me being like, oh, can I fish off this dock? What can I do? Where can I go? What can I see, you know? And that would end up being, you know, one of the core components in Bethesda games from that point on, whether you're talking Fallout or Elder Scrolls or probably anything Bethesda's ever going to do in the future. That concept of just being able to see the open world and then go where you want to go and discover cool stuff when you go where you want to go is a part of what makes their games so special. It's a part of what has made people put, you know, thousands of hours into Oblivion, even more into Skyrim, modding it, buying it many times over, because there's just something about that sense of just raw video game exploration that is so special to so many of us. Now with Oblivion being an Xbox 360 game, it really does exist in a window of gaming for me that is very near and dear to my heart. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, you know, I grew up playing games, age of 4, my mom gave me an NES controller. I owe a lot of my passion for video games to her because she's just as passionate about games as I am. And she got me into Earthbound and Metroid and Mario. But the 360 era, you know, me being 16 years old when Oblivion came out, in fact, was like, you know, playing games with friends and just so many first-time experiences that I fell in love with. I mean, Call of Duty 2 just exploding, you know, in a really big way for me. And then Gears of War and Halo 3. There was just something about the games on the 360 that really ignited a lot of new adventures, a lot of new memories, not just for myself, but for my friends when it came to gaming. In the case of Oblivion specifically, it was the first time that my mom and I were both in tandem excited about an entry in the Elder Scrolls franchise. With Morrowind, I had played it a lot and then kind of handed it over to her and said, I think you'll like this game. That's kind of always how I did things. I'd play a game and I knew what my mom liked, right? I knew what she could play. And while it was like first person and she wasn't really used to those types of controls, I was like, this is something you could get into. And she did. She ended up loving Morrowind. She played a lot of it. So when we heard that Oblivion was actually happening on the Xbox 360, it was, you know, that first like time where we got to share a fan moment together. Like, whoa, dude, can't wait for this. I still remember being excited about the reveal trailer with her. And when the game came out, we picked up our copies at midnight and we sat down and played the game in parallel. And this is really what gave birth, I think, to that concept for us and so many other people out there of sharing your single player experience with another person as if it was multiplayer. So, you know, we sit down and start making our characters. Oh, who are you going to play as? What race are you going to play as? Oh, okay. All right, how far along are you? You know, what did you do first, right? And that's something that has been echoed throughout Bethesda games. You know, you sit down and you play Skyrim with your friends, and everybody kind of has their own path, their own journey, their own way of doing things. The same thing with Fallout. In fact, when Skyrim came out, I had a midnight release party with like 5 of us, and we all had TVs and Xboxes hooked up in the same room together, and we all sat down and played the game, and within the first hour we were all off doing completely different things, and it was like okay to look at the other person's screen because you weren't having your story spoiled, you were just looking at their story, right? So that's how Oblivion went for my mom and I, and it was really special because of that. I didn't just play Oblivion and experience my journey to become the hero of Kavach. I played it alongside of my mom, and I got to watch her journey to become the hero of Kvatch. And that was the point at which my mom decided she was going to turn games like The Elder Scrolls and Skyrim and Fallout into competitions between us. And so my friends would come over and she would brag. She would brag about how much gold she had. She would brag about the mission she'd completed and how far along she was in the game. And that always brings a smile to my face to this day. So yeah, Oblivion's a very special game for me on a lot of levels, including a lot of which that exist outside of the game world itself. But I like to look at the Elder Scrolls franchise like each one is its own individual dish, its own individual piece of food, right? Like think of a dish that you really enjoy, a dish that is very important to you on an emotional level. Maybe it is legitimately your grandma's apple pie. You know, maybe it's a certain meal your mom used to make, or a certain individual item you used to go out and get with someone. I mean, I have a lot of different foods and individual meals that are like that. And that's kind of how I've always looked at Morrowind and Oblivion and Skyrim. You know, the three biggest entries in the Elder Scrolls franchise for me is that I don't like to pit them against one another because they're special in their own unique ways. And when I sit down and when I eat a piece of Oblivion, I get certain tastes, certain flavors, right? And then I have certain sensations that come back to me. And those sensations, those tastes and flavors are different than Morrowind or Skyrim. They're all equally special, but they're very different within themselves. And for Oblivion, it was that colorful, bright, open world vibe the game had. You know, the music that Oblivion has always feels very powerful and lively. It's as if the music and the color palette of Oblivion itself is encouraging you to get out and explore in a way that you never were able to in Elder Scrolls games and pretty much in console RPGs ever before. You know, it's almost like they designed the music around that, right? So I always get that colorful, bright vibe, you know, the lush green forests. Obviously didn't have the same level of richness and detail in like the shaders and the textures, so it all comes across as just kind of bright and a little bit more flat, but in a way that almost makes it special. You know, in a way that I think has actually allowed Oblivion for me to actually age kind of well. I mean, you know, it's an old game, and I'm not saying it looks amazing on modern hardware even when it's cranked up, but it does things right where it's like you still get that emotional connection to it. I haven't reached the point where I look back at Oblivion and I say to myself, oh, how did I ever think that was beautiful or special? No, that's still there, right? It is that liveliness of it. Skyrim doesn't really have that. Skyrim has colors and, you know, it has moments where you're like, oh, this is nice, but I think Skyrim has always had that more, just a little bit of a more serious tone to its open world, to its outer world. And the thing that I like about Oblivion having that lighter open world tone is that it creates a really great contrast for when you do go into a dungeon or a cave, or more specifically, an Oblivion Gate. It makes those places feel that much darker, that much more dreary and miserable. I remember when I would see Oblivion Gates out on the open world, and I'd kind of like look at them and be like, oh, God, one of those Oblivion Gates. I look at there's an imp crawling out of it, you know? You didn't want to go inside because they were so miserable and depressing and dark, and honestly, they got repetitive, and that added to the oppressive nature of them. But you also didn't want them, like, you know, tainting the beautiful lands of Oblivion. Like, can I just close that real quick, you know? It's just, oh man, it's making Cyrodiil, this province of Cyrodiil just look terrible, and I just want to get rid of it, right? So I always loved that contrast, that juxtaposition, if you will. And thinking back to sharing my Oblivion experience with my mom, she hated Oblivion Gates. They confused her. She still wasn't like a master of first-person controls at that point in time. The dual stick, you know, thing of like aiming and looking like you would in a first-person game. And so Oblivion Gates frustrated her. So I'm pretty sure I beat like every Oblivion Gate for her ever. So I had to play all of the Oblivion Gates twice. And it would almost just be like one of those moments for me where she's like, Tony, can you come help me with Elder Scrolls? And I'm like, oh, I don't want to close another Oblivion Gates, you know? They were not one of the greatest pieces of design in Oblivion, but I almost always think that I'll look back at that as being like a good thing. You know, the fact that the Oblivion Gates were repetitive and that they were so dark and miserable, you know, really did. Again, it added to that oppressive and frustrating nature of them, you know, where you were like, just there's a bit of a shiver that went down your spine when you saw one out in the open world. And when you had to close it, it was like, let me just get through this as fast as I can. This is miserable on all possible levels. Man, there's some magic to Oblivion. You know, I think there's a piece of magic in every Bethesda game, for as jank as like Skyrim was in some cases, and You know, when you look at Bethesda games and the places in which they fall short, there's always just something about their game design that leaves a bit of magic in them for me. You know, even Fallout 4, which is probably my least favorite Bethesda game ever made. There's just a lot of things I don't like about it. Decisions that they made still has that magic. And I think a lot of that magic for me in that game lies within like Diamond City and some of those more unique locations. And Oblivion was a game just loaded with goodness like that. You know, it was one of the first iterations, I think, of an Elder Scrolls game where you could see the world, you could be a part of the world, and where the world really did genuinely feel like it was connected, and you could go out and find all those little bits and pieces of special goodness. And Oblivion just exploded beyond that. You know, it had DLCs, it had the Shivering Friggin' Isles, which was, I think, one of the biggest expansions I ever played in a game, period, at that point in time. I honestly could go on for hours about Oblivion. I could run a podcast on Mondays with Mo if I was honest, or each and every Monday we had like a 2-hour-long discussion about some of my favorite old games. But why don't we keep it at the length I think we're at now? Really, I want to hear from you guys. You know, you Oblivion fans out there, you Elder Scrolls fans out there. What does Oblivion mean to you? You know, like, how old were you when you played Oblivion? What did you love about the game? You don't necessarily have to get super critical here. Mondays with Mo has never really been about that. But what does the game mean to you? You know, what sort of memories does Oblivion invoke when you think about the game? You know, the music, the setting, the color, the vibrance, the taste of that experience, if you will. And in a sense, as I referenced earlier, games are like a meal. They're like a piece of food, you know? And they have different flavors, they have different tastes, and those things stick with you in memory. You know, you can remember that really, really great slice of apple pie your grandma used to make, that amazing roast beef sandwich you used to have at that deli with your uncle. You know, the flavors just come rushing back to you when you just think about them, if you had them enough times and they're really that deeply seated into your mind. Games are just like that. So what does Oblivion taste like to you when you think about it today, here in 2018? Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.
You have been brought here for a purpose, the most important task of your lives.